Hey, I'm Serenity and this is my channel, and today we're joined here by Ginger. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be discussing the case of a teenager who killed her mom solely based on the fact she flunked out of college. This case is wild, but at the same time, the amount of people, kids, offsprings who kill their parent for trivial reasons and specifically for reasons related to school, that's a whole other ballpark. So I don't know if I'm going to be making this a regular series, but I am going to be titling this under Delinquent Offsprings as a series. As I was researching this case, I realized how many other cases there are where, well, children kill their parents. Before we go any further, I do want to say there are timestamps down below. Use them if you want, skip around, but as always, I recommend stopping at the trigger warnings. Before we begin, I do want to give trigger warnings for the following: murder, knife violence, and talks of schizophrenia and mental health. If any of these topics you believe you would be unable to handle, please stop watching, put yourself first, and I'll see you at a later date with a different video. If I get any information wrong, please kindly let me know down below. I tried to get the following information as accurate as possible. However, I used multiple different sources and some sources said different things. So I try to go with the most commonly reported aspect. Lastly, this video is an informational research study that I'm sharing for academic entertainment reasons only. I mean absolutely no harm to anyone mentioned, especially the victim and the victim's family. So grab your blanket, grab a snack, grab a drink, and let's begin. Now, I'm in college and according to my analytics, most of you are too. So some aspects of this case might feel relatable in a sense, but most probably not. The year was 2020 and we all know where we were in 2020, obviously. And for one University of Mount Union student, her life was about to be turned upside down. Sydney Powell was a 19-year-old Ohioan student who attended the University of Mount Union, located in Alliance, Ohio. However, one thing about Sydney is that she wasn't very good at school. In 2018, she graduated from the St. Vincent St. Mary High School with honors and planned to continue her higher education. August of 2018 marked Sydney's first semester as a college student, an incoming freshman. So the background information I'm about to give you wasn't released until during the trial, but I'm going to give it to you now so you can understand this case a bit better. Sydney didn't adapt well over to the college life. And I know for a lot of people, the transition from high school to college is pretty jarring. Whether that is just your local university in your hometown or moving to a different state for your higher education, that transition is pretty difficult. But for Sydney, it was a lot worse. After 3 poor semesters, so fall of 2018, spring of 2019, and fall of 2019, Sydney was getting bad grades, really bad grades. So in December of 2019, around when the semester was wrapping up, finals time, Sydney was told by university officials that she was suspended from the school after her poor performance in her classes and subsequent poor performing grades. She was getting low grades. However, instead of just packing up her stuff and leaving campus, Sydney chose to actively act like she was still enrolled in the school. She chose not to tell her parents. She chose not to tell her roommates, which it is assumed she was actually living on campus, so whether that's a campus dorm or something, she told no one in her life that she was suspended from school. Instead, she continued to live on campus and act like she was going to classes. During the weekdays, she would pack up her backpack and act like she was attending a class. She attended the campus parties and lived with her fellow college roommates. Well, they actually were still enrolled in college. When university officials caught wind that Sydney was still on campus after being suspended in February of 2020, 2 months after being told to leave, they informed her again that she needed to go. According to Mount Union's website, the 2024 spring semester starts in January, so we can assume the same can be said for the 2020 semester, which means it was only a couple of weeks into spring semester before Sydney was found out and asked to leave the campus again. Now, instead of returning home and just coming clean, Sydney chose to spend a week in hotel rooms before returning back to her childhood home in Akron, Ohio. It's about a 42-minute drive away from the Mount Union campus. On March 3rd, 2020, she arrived back home. Sydney's dad, Stephen Powell, checked the bank account where Sydney's tuition should have been withdrawn from, and he noticed that it wasn't taken out. The semester had already started, so why hasn't the tuition been withdrawn from the account? Most colleges, you have to pay for your semester before it even begins. So Stephen decided to confront his daughter about why this was happening, and Sydney told him she was struggling at the university and she didn't think it was the right fit for her, which is normal. A lot of people switch universities, but that wasn't really the truth. Stephen then decided to call his wife, Brenda Powell, Sydney's mom, to talk to their daughter while he went into work. She wasn't being very direct with her mother about what was going on with the school, so Brenda decided to take matters into her own hands and call the school herself to get a direct answer to her questions. She was on the phone with a university employee when they heard a loud thud over the phone, followed by a female screaming and a few more thuds. The line then went dead, and the employee tried to call back the line, but there was no answer. They continued to call until finally someone picked up Brenda's phone and answered, "This is Brenda." But the employee knew this wasn't the voice of the woman they were just on the phone with. They actually recognized the voice as Sydney Powell's, the student who was suspended for poor grades. The official immediately hung up the call and called the Arkan police, reporting that they had just heard over the phone some sort of incident happen, and they dispatched officers right away to the house. When police arrived on scene around 1 p.m., Sydney lied to them, claiming there was a break-in to the house, and this break-in person assaulted her mother, and Brenda was shouting at her daughter during this assault to get out of the house. Sydney was bloody and hysterically crying, but no major physical injuries could be located on her body. She had minor injuries, but nothing too dire of an emergency. The same could not be said for 50-year-old Brenda Powell. She was found with life-threatening injuries covered in her own blood on the floor of her bedroom, and she was immediately transported to the Cleveland Clinic Archon General Hospital, where she sadly would pass away from her injuries later, with her death immediately being classified as a homicide. Sydney was immediately arrested for the assault and resulting death of her mother. She actually stayed in the hospital overnight because she had some minor injuries and they wanted to keep her for monitoring, but just 2 days later, on March 5th, 2020, she was released on a $250,000 bond after her arraignment. The bail was set at $250,000 with a maximum pretrial supervision and a psych evaluation. Through this arraignment in court documents, the 19-year-old was charged with the murder of her mom, which resulted after verbal argument that turned physical. This confrontation stemmed from Brenda calling the university to get the answers to her questions from her daughter that her daughter was refusing to answer. During this argument, Sydney used household kitchen items to fatally stab and blunder her mom, cutting her in multiple places, an attempt to subdue her from talking to the university official. Now, who was Brenda Powell? She was a child life specialist at the Archon Children's Hospital in the Showers Family Center for Childhood Cancer and Blood Disorders, which is usually the oncology hematology unit in a hospital. She was very good at her job. She worked at the hospital for over 28 years, more than half of her life. Her coworkers and patients all adored Brenda. She would just light up the room with her energy. Many of them actually felt like they had lost a family member after Brenda's death, and she was like a second mom to many of the patients. The Powells were, by all regards, the all-American typical family. Both parents, Steve and Brenda, had good jobs. They had 2 children, which means Sydney has a sibling, and they would take family vacations to the beach and Disney World. They would play sports in the yard, but overall they were a pretty quiet family that kept to themselves. By no means was this incident something that could have been predicted to happen, nor was it something anyone close to the family felt like was going to happen, especially because many people in this community said that Sydney and Brenda were super close. They were not just mother and daughter, they acted like best friends. The vice president of marketing at the University of Mount Union, Melissa Gardner, released a statement that the university was cooperating with the police investigation and how the news was distressing to many staff and students on campus. A school official from the high school that Sydney graduated from held a prayer service for the Powell family the following day after learning that a former student was involved in the incident. Both institutes offered support for the students and staff. Now, keep in mind this case was unveiling during the pandemic, so a lot of trials were being pushed back until it was safe to be in courtrooms. On April 20th, 2020, Sydney Powell was in court, well, more like on Zoom, in Summit County Common Plea Court on charges of tampering with evidence, felonious assault, and murder. Sydney stayed in jail for almost 2 years awaiting her trial, but of course it couldn't happen because it was during the pandemic. And finally, on February 8th, 2022, once courts started opening up again, Dawn Malarsic, her attorney, announced that they would now be changing the 21-year-old Sydney Powell's plea from guilty to not guilty by reason of insanity after an evaluation with a doctor. She was set to go to trial for murder in Summit County Common Plea Court, but now planned to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. On February 11th, 2022, more information was released on how the crime scene looked upon arrival by the Archon police. They claimed they discovered Sydney Powell laying on the ground near the end of the driveway with her eyes rolled back into her head, clawing at the concrete, causing her fingers to start to bleed from the pressure. According to Dawn Millar, her attorney, and I quote directly, "She absolutely in shock, in a chaotic state, not responding to audio stimuli." That was what Sydney, according to him, looked like upon arrival. He went on to say in an interview about the week Sydney spent in hotels before returning home had caused Sydney an unsurmountable amount of strain and created a psychotic break from reality, leading leading to her mom's death. Finally, it was time for the trial to begin, and it started in September of 2023. In their opening statements, the Summit County prosecutors opened the trial by presenting the facts. Sydney Powell was on trial for murder because she ended her mom's life by stabbing her repeatedly using a steak knife from the Powell kitchen and repeatedly hitting Brenda with a cast iron frying pan, which, if you know anything, those are really heavy. Then, to cover up her own actions, she chose to break a window in the house to stage it looking like someone had tried to break in. Prosecutors then broke down Sydney's repeated lies made before and after her mom's death, and they specifically pointed out that Sydney attempted to cover up evidence of the assault by breaking that window, proves she was of sane mind during the attack. Assistant Summit County Prosecutor Joe McAleese said, and I quote, "Sydney Powell did take her mother's life, and she knew in doing so that her actions were wrong." Now, on the contrary, Don McClark, the defense attorney, argued that 3 separate psychologists had evaluated Sydney, and they had diagnosed her with schizophrenia. And at the time of the assault, she was suffering from a psychotic break. He claimed Sydney was hearing voices in her head, having delusions, which led her to losing her self-control and ending her mom's life. McClark urged the 12 jurors to find his client not guilty of the crime by reason of insanity. He stated, and I quote, "The science is overwhelming and it supports insanity." The trial was overseen by Judge Kelly McLaughlin in her courtroom, and during opening statements, Sydney was seen crying, wiping her tears away, and bouncing her feet anxiously. She was facing 2 counts of murder, 1 count for purposely causing the death, and the other that involves causing the death as an result of felonious assault, as well as felonious assault and tampering with evidence. Now, the trial was actually being broadcasted through Court TV, and a 4th psychologist determined that during the murder, Sydney actually was of sane mind. In front of the jurors, there were 3 possible verdicts they could come to. 1, guilty. 2, not guilty. And 3, not guilty by reason of insanity, which was the outcome the defense was wishing for. Sydney's dad and Brenda's husband, Stephen Powell, along with Betsy Brown, Brenda's mother and Sydney's grandma, begged for the trial to not happen and repeatedly asked the prosecution to reach an agreement that meant that Sydney wouldn't have to go to trial and they wouldn't have to sit through a trial. Their main concern was that the trial would have a negative impact on Sydney's mental health, which was on the incline since her diagnosis and when she started receiving medical care and medication. Prosecutors were adamant about not believing this plea of insanity nor offering a plea deal. In return, if she couldn't handle sitting through the trial, they had set up a special viewing room for her to use at any point during the trial. So then the trial began. Assistant Prosecutor Joe McAleese opened the trial with acknowledging the fact that Sydney was under stress before the attack. She once was an honor student at St. Vincent St. Mary's High School, but her transition over to college life was not a smooth one, and she had flunked out of school due to her poor grades. In order to keep up with her lies, though, before her house of cards began tumbling down, she ended her mom's life while Brenda was on the phone with Mount Union officials, trying to get the answers to the questions her daughter refused to answer. Prosecutor McAleese stated the following, and I quote, "The truth caught up to these lies. It became overwhelming. She was stressed. Her tuition was canceled. Her enrollment was canceled. In that moment, she struck her mother with a frying pan over and over. She stabbed her over and over, hoping that was finally enough. She had the awareness to hide what she did." Now, defense attorney McClark took a different approach, telling the jury that the main question of the trial was simply why. Just why? Sydney had a good life. She was close with her mom before this incident, and also before and after this incident, there was proof by 3 experts who administered tests that came to the conclusion that she was suffering from undiagnosed schizophrenia and a psychotic break. She had no idea what she was doing when she ended her mom's life. McClark claimed there was evidence of Sydney's deteriorating mental state, with her experiencing visual and auditory hallucinations, which included her seeing fire emerge from her hands and hearing voices in her head exclaiming how much of a failure she was. Sydney lied to everyone around her by pretending she was still enrolled in classes at Mount Union. During school week, she would pack up her backpack with notebooks and pens, act like she was heading to classes, but instead she would just sit in the student center, waiting for her friends to finish with their classes. McClark claimed, and I quote, "This is a false reality. She was creating a world where just everything was okay." According to the defense, the last memory Sydney had before she killed her mother was telling her everything was going to be okay, followed by a bear hug. Right after that, her mental break happened, and I quote, "The next 25 minutes, everything she did was because of a severe mental disease. How do we know? It screams of insanity, the brutality of it, the lack of motive. Instead of fleeing the scene or hiding her bloody clothing, Sydney sat outside on the driveway until police arrived. Now, I want to interject and say, who's to say Sydney would have called the police herself or wouldn't have done any of those cover-up things if it wasn't for the Mount Union official calling the police after they ended the phone call? She realistically didn't have any time to cover up the scene, but she attempted to by breaking that window and stepping outside of the house. Would she have called 911 herself after she calmed down a bit, or was she just trying to flee the scene but couldn't get far? McClark claimed that the doctor who examined Sydney Powell at Summon Archon City Hospital diagnosed her with schizophrenia and post-traumatic stress disorder. Since her diagnosis, she has been seeing a counselor under the care of a doctor and was put on several medications, with the dosages being upped for her to survive the stress through the trial. According to McClark, and I quote, "She would be a zombie if she took these drugs without a mental health issue. This isn't pretend. We're going to ask you to trust the science. Every professional who has seen Sydney Powell has had the same diagnosis, schizophrenia. Mental illness is a real thing." The defense said Sydney didn't kill her mother over being upset about being suspended from college, but instead from a mental break. And I quote, "The family has suffered a nightmare of unimaginable consequences. I ask you to end the nightmare and return verdicts of not guilty by reason of insanity. This was a brutal attack, and that brutality speaks to the insanity of this incident." On September 13th, 2023, a psychologist for the defense testified saying that on the day of the murder, Sydney remembers sitting on the couch with Brenda one moment, then crying, followed by a need to get away and go down to the basement, then back up to the main floor. She also remembers hearing multiple voices in her head telling her that she was a loser or worthless and she should kill herself. Lastly, Sydney remembered waking up in the hospital, according to this psychologist named James Reardon. On the other hand, on September 18th, 2023, just a couple days later, clinical psychologist Sylvia O. Branowich testified for the prosecution, and according to her evaluation of Sydney Powell, she was not in a full psychosis during the incident, with moments of lucidity in the week leading up to her ending her mom's life. She was of sane mind. The chief of Summit County Criminal Division, Brian Lopritzi, said when Brenda found out Sydney was kicked out of college, Sydney got violent. And I quote, "That's when she ran, got the first thing she could find, probably the skillet, and hit her mom in the back of the head. When she didn't die, she went and got a knife and stabbed her 30 times." The Associate Dean of Students at the University of Mount Union testified at the trial, and I quote, "The phone cut us off at some point. I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 of those sort of thun sounds, and the screaming had continued." She was actually sitting next to the Dean of Students, John Fraser, at the time of the phone call, and continued on with her statement repeatedly after trying to call back, and I quote, "The voice on the other end picked up, 'Yes, this is Brenda. Yes, this is Brenda.' But it was not Brenda. I was sure it was Sydney." Both John Fraser and I looked at each other and sort of shook our heads at each other and said, "That's not Brenda." He then said, "Sydney, I think this is you. This is not Brenda." And then the phone went dead. Now, I mentioned earlier, Stephen Powell and Betsy Brown did not want Sydney Powell to go to trial. Through their attorney representing the family named Jeff LeBurn, he said, and I quote, "Victims under Marseille's law are afforded all sorts of protection and comfort, and their wishes are known so long as they're bloodthirsty. If they want a different outcome than what the prosecution wants, then they're cast aside." But this is hard because in this case, both the victim and the perpetrator have the same family. In response, the prosecutor said they would consider the community's wishes, and in the end, they knew they had the evidence they needed to get Brenda Powell the justice she deserved. And I quote, "The law does not require us to succumb to the wishes of the victim's family. The defendant's family often don't want us to prosecute their loved ones. That's not unusual at all." It was time for the closing arguments and then the jury to deliberate. On September 20th, 2023, the jury had reached their verdict. They found Sydney Powell, who is now 23 years old, guilty on 2 counts of murder, which is special felonies, 1 count of felonionis, assault, felony of the 2nd degree, and 1 count of tampering with evidence, a felony of the 3rd degree. As the verdict was read, she sobbed hysterically. A week later, on September 28th, 2023, the sentencing hearing was held. Judge Kelly McLaughlin sentenced Sydney Powell to life in prison, and then the defense asked Judge McLaughlin to impose the minimum sentence of 15 years to life. The prosecution, on the other hand, asked the judge to impose the additional 3 years charged in prison in regards to the tampering charge. In the end, Judge McLaughlin granted the ability for parole after serving a minimum of 15 years. In her closing statements, the judge addressed the courtroom by saying, and I quote, "To the victim, to the family, and the friends, I am terribly sorry for your loss here. I cannot imagine what you've been through." The defense attorney, McClark, said in response to the sentencing, and I quote, "This is not justice." And in knowing that Sydney's attorney planned to appeal the sentence, Judge McLaughlin advised her not to say anything at the sentencing sentencing. The Powell's family attorney, though, spoke at the sentencing, asking for Judge Laughlin to consider the family and friends' wishes and their letters given to the councilwoman when deciding the sentence to go with the case. I'm going to quote exactly what he says, and I quote, "The tone and tenor of those letters, I think, is consistent with what the court saw throughout the trial, and what the court continues to see here today, that they love and support Sydney no matter what. They will continue to love and support her, and they've been a consistent and constant presence in her life and in the courtroom. This will continue as we move forward. They love and support her, and they're going to take care of whatever she may need." He went on to say that the family's biggest concern was for Sydney to receive mental health treatment during her sentence. He then asked if he could read a character letter received from a doctor who worked at the hospital along with Brenda. I'm going to quote it directly, but it is kind of lengthy, so stay with me. "I have almost never felt so strongly that I need to offer a voice of advocacy as I have in this tragic situation of an unfathomable verdict and the tragic current of ripple effects it will undoubtedly have upon this loving family. I have repeatedly heard from those who know Brenda well, their intimate knowledge of Brenda, her family, her husband, and Sydney, that they have endured incredible loss as a result of Sydney's actions on that horrible day. Even though it's literally beyond words and many people's comprehension how tremendously loving they have been and remain towards Sydney, it is their clear knowledge of her mental illness and impairment, and the powerful clarity that Brenda herself, if she were still alive, would without a doubt want the unwavering support of Sydney's continued treatment for her mental condition in the least restrictive environment possible, with as much family connection and contact as possible. The people who know Brenda, the people who know Sydney, are all asking this court to consider the constitutional wishes of the victims and impose the minimum sentence." Then a character letter was actually written by Stephen Powell, Sydney's father, Brenda's husband, and it was reviewed, and I'm going to quote it. "Throughout our 24 years of marriage that we all know was cut short in March of 2020, to this day, I can confirm with 100% degree of certainty that this is not what people are saying is justice for Brenda Powell. I believe that since there can never be true justice in this case, Sydney's mental health should remain our top priority." Lastly, he asked the judge to consider having Sydney serve her sentence at a mental health institute rather than the prison she was currently being held in, the Ohio State Reformatory for Women in Maryville, Ohio. She had 30 days for her attorney to file an appeal, which they said they would do, with the Court of Appeals, and planned to specifically point out in the appeal the issues in challenging the way insanity pleas and defenses are written in Ohio. Now, there's no news if this appeal was ever filed, but Sydney and her team had until the end of October 2023 to do so. That is all the information on this case. I don't want to say it's cut and dry because it's not super complicated, but it is a shorter case than I usually cover. Now, we may never know if Sydney truly does have schizophrenia. Maybe she had some undiagnosed mental illness at the time of the incident. Maybe everything that happened to her accumulated and she broke. But what I will say, I obviously don't know this family and I wish them well. I will say though that those two officials, Dean and the Assistant Dean of Students, were on the phone when this crime happened. They probably are dealing with some unsurmountable form of trauma from hearing someone be bludgeoned to death, stabbed to death over the phone, and not be able to do anything about it. Yes, they hung up and they called 911 and they are probably the reason why Brenda has justice. But they have to deal with knowing they heard someone die, be murdered over the phone for the rest of their life. What about their grief and pain? You know, they're technically not the victim. They were there witnessing the murder, audibly. And I think if Sydney is given her pill and it is approved, she should still have to spend some time in a mental institution until she gets better. But also, if she's just let off, I don't want to say like she doesn't have mental illness or she does. I don't know. It is definitely the plea the defense went with. But if she is let off, what example does that set for anyone else who wants to do this? You know, I said at the beginning of this video, I have a list of children, and I say children, offspring, teenagers to young adults who kill their parents over something like this, something about school related. Who's to say that someone in a similar situation doesn't do it too? Sydney used the insanity plea and she got off, so why can't I? You know, it doesn't set a good precedent, especially knowing that they know who the killer was. What I do want to say though is by all accounts, it seemed like Stephen and Brenda were great parents and they would have supported Sydney if she'd been kicked out. Would they have been mad? Every parent would be mad, but would they have gotten over it? Probably. I mean, Stephen and Brenda's own mom are sticking by her through thick and thin. They seem like a parent who would have been understanding, and I'm not sure, and you can let me know down below. If you're suspended from a school, can you go to another school? Is it like on your record forever? I don't know how that works. Could you enroll in another school or at the very least a community college? If it was for bad grades and not like intoxication on campus or assaulting another campus member, couldn't she just enroll in another school? She literally told her dad she didn't think it was a right fit for her. This case is just so difficult to try to analyze because the victim and the victim's family are the same family. So that is all the thoughts I have on this case. That is everything I have on this case. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down below. below. I'm interested to hear about the pill, if it gets approved, if it doesn't. You know, at the very least, I think if the family believes that she should be in a mental institute instead of jail, she should. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you aren't already. We are doing 3 videos a week for the next couple months. My socials are all linked down below if you want to follow me. They are also on screen. You don't have to, but if you want to. As always, a palette cleanser is the doggo picture of the day. Is going to be this picture of Nova. You know, she's a nap queen. She loves her naps. All right, love you, Mina, kisses, don't do things stupid, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye!